Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So this week what we're going to be doing is a little bit of a departure from my normal kinds of projects. I'm going to be building a board from scratch, and what we have here today is the Minigun Supergun. So this is an open source project made by Frank FJS, and what it allows you to do is take original arcade hardware, connect it up to your TV, and play it just as though it was like a console, like a Super Nintendo or a Genesis or anything else. I really love projects like this, and I think that it allows you to take something that seems inaccessible, like an arcade game, and make it accessible so you can play it just like anything else pretty easily. I grew up, in the 80s and 90s, and so arcades were a huge part of my life. For those of you that didn't, I'm sorry, you missed out on something really cool, but thankfully, it's something that you can still experience in lots of different ways today. Lots of arcade games got ported to consoles. There's emulation, but to me, I think this is a really nice way of playing arcade games because you don't need to have a massive arcade, in your house. You also don't have to worry about maintaining one of those kinds of machines. This means you just need the circuit board. You can connect it up and you can play it. So today what we're going to do is we're going to take this board, which I got from PCBWay, and we're going to populate it with all of these parts that we have here, and I'll show you how to do that, at least the way that I think makes the most sense. And then we'll go ahead and we'll test it out, and I'll show you some of the features that it has. All right, so let's get started. But first, let me take a couple of seconds for a word from the sponsor of this video, PCBWay. PCBWay is the place that I always choose whenever I need PCBs manufactured for my projects, and their help was essential for the project that we're going to be covering today. They offer very high quality prototype PCBs, and they allow you to personalize your projects more than ever before. The advanced PCB options allow you to really dial in the look and feel of your project, and now there are even new options for your solder mask, including pink, gray, orange, and transparent colors. So I highly recommend that you check out the link in the video description and give PCBWay a try. Okay, so back to this week's project. All right, so we're ready to get started with building this PCB, and I think that it helps to have a plan of approach when you're building something like this. So for me personally, I always start with the shortest components. So that would be the surface mount capacitors and resistors. There's one surface mount chip, which is this one right here. This is the THS7374. This is an RGB encoder, so it's kind of like the heart and soul of the whole thing. So we're going to set that right over here. And you can see this is a really nice silk screen. It has lots of good information about what you need to do. So this little dot here tells you that the chip should be facing this way. If you can see here, there's also a dot on the chip. So you just line those two up with each other, and so this is how the chip is supposed to be oriented. I've also got this little dip switch right here, this little surface mount dip switch, so we're going to set that up right over here. So I'll start with those components, and then from there I'm going to move on to some other surface mount components. So for this part, I would say these two are probably the toughest to get soldered in place, so I'm going to be using a fine tip to get these legs in place. I also recommend magnification. I mean, I'm not going to do it because that way you guys can see what I'm doing, but if I wasn't trying to film this, I would use like a microscope or some kind of magnifying lens so that I could look at these legs close up and make sure that they're all soldered in correctly. The last thing you want is some liquid flux because it'll just make your joints nice and clean and prevent things like bridges from happening. All right, so let's start putting this thing together. All right, so we've got our RGB encoder installed, and we've got this little dip switch here installed, and I'm just going to explain briefly what this thing does. So this thing is here for certain types of board sets, like for example, Neo Geo, or maybe Sammy Atomiswave, for example. So there are some companies that didn't fully adhere to the JAMA standard, and they added extra buttons on the JAMA harness in these unused spots. So, for example, Neo Geo has 4 buttons, A, B, C, and D, and so A, B, and C are part of the JAMA standard, but then if you flip these dip switches up, you can get those 4th buttons on the JAMA harness itself so that this thing is compatible with Neo Geo games. That's just one example. So, it's a little bit convoluted. I don't want to go into all the details of how different arcade boards are wired up in terms of their harness, but this does increase compatibility with certain types of board sets. All right, so now that the most difficult part is done, and it's nice that that's kind of out of the way first, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take all of the surface mount components, these resistors and capacitors, and this one LED over here, and we're going to solder all of those into place. They don't have any polarity with the exception of the LED. And honestly, I actually don't know how to tell the polarity on this surface mount LED. I'm going to try to see if I can figure it out. In absolute worst case, if I screw it up, then I simply just have to remove the component and flip it around and install it correctly. So the same is true for you. But ideally, I'd like to know how you can tell these surface mount LEDs apart and figure out what part is the anode and what part is the cathode. All right, well, now let's go ahead and get started with adding these components. All right, so all of our surface mount components are installed. I just wanted to make one comment about the LED. So when I looked at it, it had some turquoise kind of markings on one side, which I think are the cathode side, the positive side. So I tacked it in that way so that the turquoise markings are on the positive side. If I'm wrong, then the LED simply won't work, and it's just a matter of desoldering it and flipping it around and reconnecting it. So hopefully it doesn't come to that, but no big deal if it does. All right, so now the project keeps getting easier and easier. So what we have left to install are all through-hole components. So we've got this one here. This goes to the kick harness, and so what the kick harness is for certain games, like for example Street Fighter 2, which have extra buttons, up to 3, that are not present on the normal JAMA standard. Normally those are mapped to the kicks in a fighting game, like weak, medium, and strong kick, and so hence the name kick harness. We've got these 3 potentiometers. These are going to be used to adjust the balance, the intensity of the colors, so red, green, and blue. I'll show you guys that once the system is fully assembled. We've also got a stereo headphone jack over here, which is going to go right there. That's just an additional breakout for the audio. So the audio is going to be going into this 8-pin mini DIN jack in addition to the video, but this just gives us a separate breakout for sound if we need it. This little 3-pin header is going to go right here, and this allows us to toggle between mono sound, which is a lot of games, or some games which have stereo, like for example, the Neo Geo MVS is stereo, so you would just take this little jumper and toggle it from mono to stereo. And then finally, we've got these little buttons right here. These are used either for coin or for service/test modes. That's what goes right here. These might also be accessible on the arcade PCB itself, but if it isn't, this gives you the option to access it from over here. All right, so let's go ahead and put in these components and then move on from there. All right, so we're just about there. What we've got left now are basically the really large components. So we've got our 8-pin mini DIN, which is going to go here. This is what is going to output the RGB and the stereo sound or the mono sound to a SCART cable. There's also a version of this Supergun that also uses a Genesis Model 2 connector instead. So that's really nice if your whole setup is centered around component video and HD Retrovision cables. Then instead of this connector, you can use a Genesis Model 2 and HD Retro cables and connect that up to your setup. Definitely worth keeping in mind. These are Db15 connectors, so these will go here, and those will interface with like a Neo Geo style joystick. And so you can either buy these or you can make them yourself. There's lots of options that way. But basically a Neo Geo joystick, ideally with 6 buttons instead of just the standard 4, would be perfect for this setup. We've also got this little connector right here. This is going to be used for power. So on the bottom of the board, it tells you all the voltages, and those are going to come from an arcade power supply. So we've got plus 5 volts. Normally, those power supplies give up to like 15 amps. I'm sorry, yeah, 15 amps, that's right. Then you've got your minus 5 volts, which some games use and some don't, and usually it's 1 amp. And then you've got your plus 12 volts, and I think that's usually like 2 or 3 amps. And then, of course, you've got your grounds. So that's where that's all going to connect up. And then finally, we've got our electrolytic capacitors. Those are really easy to set up. They all have a stripe, and so the stripe indicates the negative side, and that's also indicated here on the silk screen. And very helpfully, the silk screen has all of the values that you need as well. And I didn't mention this earlier in the video, but the project also lists a bill of materials. So you just have to go there and get all these components and go shopping at a place like Mouser or DigiKey, and you'll get all the pieces you need to make this Supergun. All right, so let's go ahead and put these parts in. All right, so there's basically only a few other things left to install and discuss. One is that this board has an optional voltmeter that you can install over here. And what's really nice about that is that it allows you to tell what the voltage is, the 5-volt rail basically, once you plug in a game. So you can adjust the 5-volt rail on these switching power supplies, and sometimes, depending on the game, it might put a greater load on that power supply, and so it might dial the voltage down to like 4.7 or something that's not exactly 5. So since this thing has an onboard voltmeter, if you choose to install it, then you can go ahead and adjust the potentiometer on your power supply and make it perfectly 5 volts. So I don't have that, unfortunately. The person who wants this didn't want to get that part. So I can install it, but it's very simple. It's literally just plugging in here for power and measurement, and that's about it. And then over here, we've got our JAMA harness itself. And so this is the last thing we've got to do. It's a bit tricky because you have to bend these fingers into position, and you have to install it in such a way so that the board isn't mistakenly like this or like this. You're going to try to align it as best as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. It really helps to have something like these forceps are right here, because they allow you to push down on these and make sure that they're in place without burning your fingers off. All right, so let's go ahead and do this last little bit. All right, so what we've got here is the fully assembled Minigun Supergun, and before I plug a game in here, it would be really kind of foolish and dangerous just to do that without testing this thing, at least preliminarily, and making sure that the voltages are correct. So what I have set up here is a standard Suzo-Hap switching arcade power supply. This thing provides, plus 5 volts, minus 5, and 12 volts. You can see that all listed here. And this is what you'd find inside of a normal arcade cabinet. And it just plugs straight in. There's no power switch, so when you plug it in, it turns on. And then I have this little harness that I built that goes straight into the minigun. So what I want to do now is I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to test the voltages coming into this thing and just make sure that they're correct. So I have my multimeter here. It's set to measure DC, and that's what this symbol right here is. So let's turn it around. And on the PCB, you can see that the voltages coming in are actually written down on the solder mask. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to touch a ground point like over here. This is definitely ground. And now let's go ahead and touch these points and see what we find. Let me just get a good grab on there. Come on now. Yeah, there we go. So plus 5 volts, that's good. This is the minus 5. There's usually some variability there. And I'm also not plugged in. I'm not like providing a load to this power supply, so that's also a little bit different. I just want to make sure that I'm in the right ballpark. So 4.2 is a little bit low, but not the end of the world. It's like right about where I need to be. Plus 12, this is solid. And then this is also plus 5. Let me just touch it again, and that's also solid. All right, so that means that, at least without a load on here, I'm getting the correct voltages or something reasonably close to that. So that means that at least the power coming into this is going to be safe for my game. So let's go ahead now and connect this thing up to a real arcade PCB and see how it works. Okay, so now that we know that the voltages on the Supergun are perfectly fine, we're going to go ahead and test it with a real arcade board set. And so right now what I have here is the game X-Men, which was released by Konami in I think 91 or so. It's a 4-player beat 'em up. It's an absolute classic. It's one of my favorite PCBs. And so since we know everything is safe with regard to voltages, I feel like it's okay to put this on and give things a test. So I'll just show you the whole setup here. I have a joystick plugged in, and that's just one that I made, which also has the additional kick buttons if needed. And then there's our arcade power supply. And so now I'm going to go ahead and plug it in, and I fully expect the colors to be bad. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and play the game. We're going to put it into test mode, and this particular game has a calibration screen in the test mode. So I can use that to dial in the colors and get them set up. All right, so let's go ahead, plug it in, and give it a test. All right, so that's good. This is how the game is supposed to start up. Looking good so far. But like I said, the colors will very likely be wrong. No, they're not that bad. Oh, that's wrong. I don't know if you can see this on camera, but it's very washed out. The colors are too bright. But that's fine. I expected that. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to dial in the colors. And so to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to be hitting either this service or test. There we go. So I hit test, and that puts us into a test mode. So most arcade games have some kind of test mode like this, and most of them also have some way of calibrating the screen. This is pretty standard because arcade monitors also need to be adjusted for geometry and color balance, and so most games will have this built in. So let's go to color check, and this is a really good color check. So you can see that it's dialed up way too high. So there's changes in color, but then like very early on, you see that the colors become consistent, and those should all be different steps. As you're looking, like these should all be different steps, and instead it's a solid color. So that means that the gain for the R, G, and B is way too high. And you can also see on the left hand side, those bars should all be colorless. They should all be black, and they're definitely not. So what I'm going to do now is sorry for the change in everything. So here's our color pots. And so I'm going to go ahead and just dial them in. You can see what I'm doing. So this is red, so I'm going to dial in red, and I'm going to try to reduce the intensity here. So now red is lower. And it's not quite perfect yet, but now you can see that there's a clear change in color intensity on all the bars. I think I need to go even lower, because you see how it says colorless, and there's still color, at least on one or two of those bars. So I'm going to continue adjusting. This time I'll show you the screen while I do it. So there, I've cut out the green completely. You see that? But basically, you want to see all the different steps. I think I need to dial down blue even more. About there. Let's just see, is red. Red is, well, that's way too intense. It's about there. That's completely gone. That's too much. And you can see the bars showing up as I slowly dial things down on the potentiometer. Like that. So here's blue, too strong, and I'm going to dial that down. Just make sure about red. Red still seems a little too strong. Okay. Well, it's definitely looking a lot better. So you can see that there are bars of intensity for all those different steps now. All right, so now if we go ahead and if we start the game over, we hit exit and exit, and now we should see the colors looking a lot more normal. There we go. Much better. All right, so it looks like this Supergun is working perfectly. I still need to go through and actually play games like Player 1 and 2. I need to also test out the kick harness. I would need a game like Street Fighter 2 to do that. But overall, it looks like this project was a success. And now with this little piece of kit, I can play arcade games in my living room on my setup. All right, guys, so I hope you like this kind of content. If you do, then consider subscribing to the channel, because I have videos out like this every week, and it's always good to get some kind of feedback from you about what kind of projects you're interested in and what you'd like me to work on next. And then, of course, if you guys have any consoles that need to be repaired or modified, you can also reach me directly at oneuprestorations.com. All right, guys, thanks again for watching, and I will see you next time.